Hello and welcome. My name is Patrick Gill, a research analyst with the Kinder Institute's Houston Education Research Consortium, also known as HERC. Today, I will be presenting findings from our ongoing Career Technical Education, or CTE, study related to degree attainment. This presentation is part 3 of a 5-part series examining the post-secondary trajectories of CTE graduates. Previous presentations in the series looked at college enrollment and college majors for CTE graduates, and the next 2 presentations will bridge the gap between college and workforce success. The presentation series will culminate with our July 12th Summer Regional CTE meeting. Before we jump into today's findings, let's review some high-level takeaways from the first presentation in the series about college enrollment. Looking back at the first presentation, which was shared on Thursday, May 26th, we have a few main takeaways. First, although CTE graduates were slightly more likely to enroll in college than non-CTE graduates, these differences were fairly small, and about 60% of graduates from both groups enrolled at some point within 6 years of high school graduation. Second, most graduates who ever enrolled in college, over 90% in fact, did so either during or immediately after high school. So most students who are ever going to go to college do so early on in their post-secondary lives. And by immediately after high school, a term I'll use several times today, I mean in the academic year immediately following their high school graduation. And finally, looking at those graduates who enrolled in college immediately after high school, we saw that CTE graduates were much more likely to be at 2-year institutions, while non-CTE graduates were more likely to be at 4-year institutions. Keep those enrollment patterns in mind, as they will be important as this presentation goes along. Turning now to today's results, we set out to answer a few key research questions. First, we compared CTE and non-CTE graduates across a few dimensions related to degree or certification attainment, including whether either is more likely to get any certification or degree, as well as timing of college enrollment, institution type, and degree type. We also examined whether there are differences in degree attainment among CTE graduates by CTE career cluster. Speaking of CTE graduates, before we dive in, let's briefly review what we mean by that term. Based on graduate CTE engagement during high school, we have grouped them into 2 broad categories, CTE graduates and non-CTE graduates. CTE graduates are those who had the most CTE engagement during high school, either completing or concentrating in one career cluster, while non-CTE graduates had less engagement with CTE as a whole or with a single career cluster. About 2/3 of graduates in this study are classified as CTE graduates, so most graduates in Texas meaningfully engaged with CTE during high school. Now let's talk about who was included into today's analyses. In conducting this study, we wanted to make sure that graduates were given enough time since first enrolling in college to have potentially gotten the degree we're checking for. When looking at 2-year degrees, associate's degrees, or professional certifications, we limited analyses to graduates who had had at least 3 academic years since they first enrolled in college, including the one they first enrolled in. For bachelor's degrees, we limited the sample to graduates with at least 5 years since they first enrolled in college. We capped analyses at those with 8 years since first enrolling in college because our original sample included a small number of graduates who graduated from high school very early and are not an accurate representation of the sample as a whole. In addition, graduates had to have enrolled in the appropriate institution type to be included in degree analyses. So for 2-year degrees or certifications, we limited our analysis only to those who ever enrolled in a 2-year institution. And for bachelor's degrees, only to those who ever enrolled in a 4-year institution. Unfortunately, due to data limitations, we were not able to include graduates who ever enrolled in college out of state. If folks are interested in learning more about this decision, I am happy to discuss further. One further note here on the time since first enrolling element on this slide. This does mean that certain graduating cohorts theoretically had more time to achieve degrees than others, but our statistical models attempted to correct for this by accounting for both students' graduation year and the number of years since they first enrolled in college. So all in all, statewide, this allowed us to look at nearly 880,000 graduates for the 2-year analyses and more than 375,000 graduates for the 4-year analyses. Okay, now that we've established a baseline for who we're talking about, let's take a look at today's key findings. Overall, we found that CTE and non-CTE graduates who enrolled in college are about equally likely to attain post-secondary certifications or degrees. Within that, though, we also found that for both CTE and non-CTE graduates, those who enrolled in college during or immediately after high school were more likely to get certifications or degrees, along with those who enrolled at 4-year institutions or multiple institution types in the year right after graduating high school. Looking at graduates who ever went to two-year institutions, we also found that only about 20% ever received a two-year certification or degree, while 60% of graduates who ever enrolled at a four-year institution received a bachelor's degree. And lastly, we did not find differences in degree attainment by CTE career cluster among CTE graduates. Now that we've gone over the high-level findings, let's explore the results in more depth. Overall, about half of both CTE and non-CTE graduates who enrolled in college had gotten some kind of degree or certification 5 to 8 years after first enrolling. So broadly, CTE and non-CTE graduates who enroll in college are about equally likely to get something from their college careers. But digging further into those numbers, we see some variation. For instance, what you see here is the likelihood of attaining degrees or certifications by whether or not graduates enrolled in college during or immediately after high school. The blue bars show the likelihood of getting any kind of post-secondary certification or degree, both 2-year and 4-year, 5 to 8 years after first enrolling in college, while the orange bars show only the chances of attaining a bachelor's degree. The blue bars include all graduates who ever enrolled in college, while the orange bars are limited only to those who ever enrolled in a 4-year institution. You can see here that graduates, both CTE and non-CTE, who enrolled in college during or immediately after high school were much more likely to attain degrees or certifications than those who enrolled later. Recall that most graduates who ever enrolled in college did so right away, so most fall into the 2 bars on the left, but for those who did wait to go to college for whatever reason, their likelihood of completing it are much lower. Not only did going to college right away matter, but it turns out where students went immediately after high school was also important. It turns out that even looking at just those graduates who were in college right after high school, those who were enrolled at 4-year institutions or multiple institution types at the same time were much more likely to attain degrees or certifications than those who were enrolled at 2-year institutions. These patterns are the same for both CTE and non-CTE graduates. Remember, though, that CTE graduates were much more likely to enroll at 2-year institutions right away, while non-CTE graduates were more likely to be at 4-year institutions. So while degree attainment may be similar for CTE and non-CTE graduates who were enrolled at the same types of institutions, differences in enrollment patterns are also an important factor. It's important to note again that the blue bars, those labeled any degree type, include bachelor's degrees. The groups being compared in the blue and orange are different because the orange only includes those who ever enrolled at 4-year institutions, while the blue includes all graduates who ever went to college. Keep in mind that the degrees reflected in blue also includes those in the orange. If, for example, the graduate started at a 2-year institution, later transferred to a 4-year, and went on to receive a bachelor's there. Before we move on, I want to pause on the graduates who are enrolled at multiple institution types in the same academic year. Every member of this group was enrolled at least one 4-year institution. For example, this could include students enrolled at both HCC and U of H simultaneously, taking classes at both. You may remember from presentation 1 that this is a small group overall, only between 10 and 15% of graduates. But it turns out that this small group is the most likely to attain degrees or certifications. In fact, about 70% of these graduates get something. Being enrolled at multiple types of institutions at the same time implies some level of intentionality and familiarity with the college system, which may be helping these graduates translate their enrollment to degrees at such high rates. Learning more about these graduates may provide important insight for helping college enrollees come away with some kind of degree or certification. Let's turn away from where graduates were enrolled in the year immediately after high school and zoom out to any graduates who ever enrolled at a 2-year institution, regardless of timing. You can see here that for both CTE and non-CTE graduates, only about 1 in 5 who ever enrolled at a 2-year institution got some kind of 2-year degree, either a professional certification or an associate's degree. Professional certifications were especially rare, with only 3% of non-CTE graduates and 6% of CTE graduates getting them. Looking across CTE career clusters for CTE graduates, we see a similar story of only about 20% of those who ever enrolled at a 2-year institution getting some kind of 2-year degree or certification. Now let's look at graduates who ever enrolled at 4-year institutions. Enrolling at 4-year institutions at some point is relatively rare, with only about 1/3 of graduates doing so. For those who do, however, about 60% of them attain a bachelor's, so they are graduating college at fairly high rates. This is encouraging, especially compared to the 2-year numbers we just saw. Zooming into the top 5 career clusters for CTE graduates, again, we see a similar story with somewhere between 50 and 60% who ever enrolled at four-year institutions getting bachelor's degrees. Okay, that was a lot of information, so let's take a minute to sum up. First, about half of CTE and non-CTE graduates who enrolled in college attained some kind of post-secondary degree or certification. For both CTE and non-CTE graduates, those who enrolled in college either during or immediately after high school were much more likely to attain degrees or certifications than their peers who enrolled later. Of those who enrolled immediately after high school, over 60% of those at four-year institutions or multiple institution types got a degree or certification, compared to just 40% of those who were at a two-year institution right after high school. Regardless of timing, only about 20% of graduates who ever enrolled at two-year institutions received an associate's degree or professional certification, while about 60% of those who ever enrolled at four-year institutions received a bachelor's. And finally, looking at CTE graduates, there were not differences in degree attainment across CTE career clusters. In conclusion, these findings lead us to a couple key takeaways. First, when and where graduates start their college careers matter. Those who enrolled early and those who started at four-year institutions were much more likely to get some kind of degree or certification. So while CTE and non-CTE graduates are enrolling in college at encouraging rates, more work can be done to ensure that they are attaining the post-secondary degrees and credentials they'll need for future success. This is especially true of graduates enrolling at two-year institutions. What can we do to ensure that they have what they need to attain a two-year degree or professional certification or transfer to a four-year institution? The next presentation in this series will highlight why that success is so important, looking at workforce outcomes for CTE graduates. Thank you so much for listening today, and please don't hesitate to reach out with questions or comments.